All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials World podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking, right? It's currently October, aka the spookiest month of the year. And, some of the scary
Selling.
things, it's so fucking scary. I mean, some of the scary things that are happening right now, like, for example, women are allowed to vote. The weather is really good. You know what I mean? It's definitely not extremely
Oh yeah,
hot for
I
the
hate how
season.
it's warm 9 months out of the year. It's so scary.
It's really fucking terrifying. On top of it, America economically is doing really well. The White House is in all of its pieces. But you know what's really even more terrifying than that, Brian?
I would say the overwhelming abundance of great media that we have to constantly revisit as millennials. It scares me that we'll never be able to consume it all.
Exactly. And, it's one of those things where we just have such good media now. But I think you and I, Brian, should go back into the past to go to some spooky shows that kicked ass. You know what I mean, Brian?
Would you say maybe to pierce the spirit veil at a charge of about, 50 cents per entry? Because that's what it takes. If you pay your 50-cent entry fee, in some parts of the country, I am told, you can take part in a venture beyond the earthly realm.
Exactly. So without further ado, let's go back into the past of spooky era where we're going to talk about spook shows, otherwise known as midnight ghost shows. But before we get into it, Brian, let's bring back our segment, Cringe Generational Cringe Millennial Moment of the Week.
Generational moment of the week.
Week. Woo! Yeah! And Brian, you told me about what you wanted to cover for this segment maybe about 10 minutes before we started recording. And holy shit, do I have a lot to say about it, Brian. So just please go
Same.
ahead and introduce our cringe millennial generational topic.
We are going to talk about the rather recent influx of horror films based on public domain properties. Now, we have talked in the past, I think even on the last episode, about how everything in media's got to be mimetic now, right? Everything is about virality and everything is kind of just about like the same way an algorithm is about catching a normie's attention. This is probably one of the most irritating variants of that we've seen come about recently.
Yes, I agree. And I assume when you mention this type of segment, Brian, you're talking about like the Steamboat Willie and like Winnie the
Uh,
Pooh horror
Winnie the
films,
Pooh,
right?
Blood and Honey. Okay, so those are the ones we all know, right? You've got the Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, which has been a huge hit. There's something like four separate Steamboat Willie slasher movies, from Mousetrap to Steamboat. But there's so many of these that came out in 2024 and early 2025, Taylor. There's a Peter Pan one. There's a Cinderella one. There's a Popeye one I just saw today on Plex. Now, there is some precedent in horror for like the darker, twisted version of the fairy tale. And I want to be clear, that's not what we're talking about, right? We're specifically talking about this thing that I would say it probably has always existed, but really takes off with the Steamboat Willie thing, right? Steamboat Willie, a very specific incarnation of Mickey Mouse, enters the public domain. And immediately, every pack fucking aspiring horror director is like, well, I'm going to make a Steamboat Willie slasher movie. Mickey Mouse is a slasher? That's crazy. Around the same time, they do the same thing with Winnie the Pooh. And it's really transparent, right? This is for people, in my opinion, who aren't really interested in horror films. They're kind of like, oh my God, can you believe they're going to have Winnie the Pooh kill people? We got to see this. And they'll watch it on streaming for 15 minutes. Like every normie horror fan in America will watch the first 20 minutes of it. And they'll get a shit ton of advertising and a shit ton of like algorithmic kind of like promotion. But that's where we're at. I would say this isn't the leading thing in horror right now, but it's, I go to read some horror websites and some horror discussion communities. This is probably about 20% of the discussion right now. With a certain base in the fan club, it's, can you believe that they're going to make a Little Mermaid where she kills people? I hate it so much.
No, I hate it too. And, it's one of those things where I don't necessarily think that having horror segments about childhood memories and beloved childhood icons is inherently a bad thing. But the way
Sure.
that these movies do it is so insanely cynical and low effort that there's nothing really of quality or even of interest to me to even watch of it. So I'm just like, fuck, why is this being made? This is lazy
Well,
horseshit.
you're more right, Taylor, than I think you realize. Because I have seen Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. Like, I did watch it. I just want to say to anyone thinking about watching that, thinking, because maybe maybe you're like Taylor and I, and you're like, well, I'm curious to see this. Maybe it's weird. Potential, right? Even with such a hacked, Reddit-ass premise to be kind of subversive in some way. In Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey, Winnie the Pooh does not act like Winnie the Pooh. There's not really any reference to, I guess it takes place in the 100-Acre Wood. He acts like Jason. It's a guy in a scary Winnie the Pooh mask that acts like Jason. He doesn't speak. There's no like reference to Milne's original stories or to Disney. There's nothing like clever that ties it all in. Not that I expected there would be, and I guess that's where we're at. So if you're thinking like, well, maybe this is some sort of subversion of like Disney Americana, which to me personally would still be really hacky and not very interesting, but it would be something, right? But that's literally not even the point of all of these movies, so far as I can tell, is to not even to generate outrage. Is anyone in 2025 really outraged about Winnie the Pooh being a slasher, about Mickey Mouse being a slasher? No, it's for like GBS posting, Reddit posting millennials who think that other people are going to be outraged about it, so they're going to get all excited about it, right?
No, absolutely. Like you said, nobody's really offended by this idea anymore. Like even Disney adults wouldn't even pay attention that it existed, really. Even the most soy Disney adults wouldn't care about it. But talk about...
It's more soy to watch these movies and like them than to like Disney movies.
Yes, exactly. But talk about the idea of taking that sort of Disney or Cartoon Network Nickelodeon aesthetic and then making it into horror. But like there was a movie that came out a few years ago that I did not watch, to be very clear, but it was a movie that took that and tried to do something I would say at least kind of interesting with it, which was Escape from Tomorrow. Are you aware of this, Brian?
I know about Escape from Tomorrow. It's okay. I think it would mean more to me if I did grow up in a family where we watched Disney movies growing up, and still as an adult, like some of the Disney movies, they're like nice kids movies. I don't have a strong enough reaction for or against Disney as a corporation one way or the other. I would suspect that if maybe you grew up, let's say your parents were Disney adults, which I think a lot of Gen Alpha are going to be experiencing, right? And then you hated it and you had all that shit forced on you and you saw Escape from Tomorrow, I could see that being really, really resonating. There's a similar premise with like, there's the Banana Splits movie, right? Which was silly, but it was the same thing. It was like, well, what if the Banana Splits were like slashers? To me, that's a little more clever because the Banana Splits are such obscure characters. I guess my point being, like you're saying, Taylor, there are versions of this thing that you could do that are clever. But this very specific public domain thing, like you said, it's incredibly cynical. It's literally, I'm going to make the most rote, basic, boring slasher that no horror fan would enjoy because it's going to be so by the numbers. But I'm going to dress the killer up in some half-assed way like a Disney character or like Mickey Mouse or Winnie the Pooh. And then I'll get lots of memes made about it and get lots of online journals will talk about it. It'll be really mimetic and then I can kind of coast off of that.
Yeah, incredibly low effort bullshit.
And I guess what strikes me is this really is like a reflection of like horror right now. It's like horror that's gaming the algorithm. And it is very much about like, I'm saying it's like this unprecedented, stupid, shitty thing. And I think in many ways it is. It also is like in line with the exploitation tradition, right? The carnival barker nature or like these salacious 1950s, 1960s Hammer advertisements that make the movie look way gorier and way more like sexy than it actually is. So this is kind of in line with the tradition in horror that's like, we're going to, through an ad campaign and through kind of social mores, we're going to drum up excitement for this product.
Yes, exactly. But you know what, Brian? You know what's not low effort, boring bullshit? The Spook Show / Midnight Ghost Show. Would you agree with that, Brian? It seemed actually kind of high effort.
As far as we know, which is part of why I wanted to do this, the Spook Show is, at the time of recording, it's a few days out from Halloween. And the Spook Show is always fascinating. It's the Spook Show, the Ghost Show. Do you have any familiarity with kind of the Spook Show tradition before this episode, Taylor?
I did not know really anything about this, I'm going to be honest with you. I knew about like horror hosts and I knew about, some stuff that very theatrical horror stuff to a certain extent. But this specific thing, I had no idea what the fuck this was.
The Spook Show is crazy. The Spook Show is like a remnant still kind of from early Hollywood. It really takes off in like the 40s, but it actually predates that. Comes up, I would say, it seems like all documentation is that it comes up kind of at the same time as the talkie. The reason I say as far far as we know, or it seems to have, is because this is a case where there are not really any primary documents about the spook show because it's a multimedia presentation. It was a traveling theater event. It would happen in theaters around the country. This is, initially before the days of the multiplex, right? So it's when theater was kind of a bigger deal, right? And, sometimes traveling studios would bring their own films. They'd bring their own screens. It was a little more independent. It wasn't reels being licensed to theaters by the 5 major studios or whatever, right? The spook show is a combination of live action kind of theatricality, interplay with the audience, usually showing a short film, playing lots of scary audio, usually having people dressed up in costumes. Sometimes those relate to the film being shown. What it really goes back to is in the late 19th century, early 20th century, seances and magicians become really popular, right? That's kind of the birth of the magic act, the magician as we recognize it today. But also around that same time and kind of related, people are getting really into doing seances. I mean, there's probably a little bit of camp to it, a little bit of self-awareness, but like not as a bit, not like an escape room game. There are people who claim that they can perform seances and people are paying money to do this. It's like a cool, edgy thing you can do in the early 20th century, right? And the spook show that develops around with the seances, the early magic shows, and early film. So there's like these carnival barker guys who may or may not be able to perform seances. Let's say for the sake of let's take it at face value. That's what they're doing, right? And they travel from town to town and city to city with these lurid ad campaigns, and they put up these flyers. They write out ads in newspapers that say, you're going to come to this show. It's going to be the scariest thing you ever see. You get there, and maybe they're playing with some audio. They're playing, they probably open up with a host comes out and says some scary shit. Talks about, how tonight, the veil between our world and the other realm is very thin, and we're going to reach with it. It really gasses you up. You got to think, this is probably in the 1930s or 1940s. People, first of all, are more on edge in these decades than they might have been in the 60s or 70s, but also still easier to scare people. Horror media is not that graphic. Horror motion pictures have only been around maybe 20 years, 25 years at the earliest. So people aren't really used to stuff like this. You get worked up by this guy who's maybe kind of a city slicker who talks about demons and ghosts. And maybe they show a little film reel. And a lot of these movies, sometimes these were like Universal movies or some other B movie or movies you could see now. But sometimes they were like independently made short films for the spook show, many of which we've lost. Common element in these is that at some point during the movie, they do what's called a blackout. The screen goes out, everything's dark. And then people start screaming and the lights start flashing. And there's someone in the audience, right, dressed as a monster that you just saw on TV, like grabbing kids in the audience or probably grabbing planted actors. Let's hope. And everyone's getting so excited, so worked up. It's this big multimedia interactive thing that could only really have existed at this point in time. Because it's almost like it's got remnants of like early industrial society with like postmodern society, right? And it's this time where both of these things could coexist in a really particular way. Like you could not do this now and work people up in the same way.
No, I agree. But you know what this also reminds me of, Brian, is somebody who, or I should say somebody's work we covered on a previous episode is actually maybe inspired by this. Now I'm just realizing. You know who that is, Brian, right?
Damon Wayans.
No, I wish. It was Tom motherfucking Myers. He did something like that about 15, 20 years ago as part of his comedy series.
Fill me in on my Tom lore. I need to know about this.
So, and to be fair, I heard about this from Cumtown, so who knows how accurate this is. But allegedly, during Tom Myers, and this was his comedy tour's name, this is not a joke, it was the Heathens of Comedy Tour, which of course we always know Tom Myers, a real heathen, a real degenerate. I mean, he is degenerate, but not in that way.
He's a party animal.
But basically, he had a comedy show that was hosted by basically what was a carnival barker / like horror host who did like shitty bits and introduced various comedians. And his name was Lucifer. That's what I remember.
Awesome.
And apparently Tom Myers, as always, ate shit really bad, bombed, and then he walked off stage and cried after this whole elaborate thing he created.
Tom. This sounds like probably the coolest thing Tom's ever done. I love stupid horror host shit. It's a weird choice for him, right? It's not really appropriate for his brand or even his comedy stylings, as such as they are.
No, exactly. It would be like fucking, and he would obviously not, or I mean, he would obviously be a big fan of you comparing this to him, but it'd be like fucking Bill Hicks doing like, oh, my pussy is so gross female comedy.
It doesn't make sense. This is me being as generous as I possibly can to Tom Myers as a comedian. His whole thing is that he's like, hey, I'm just a normal guy and I notice weird things about life and I tell it like it is. That's his brand, right? That's how he presents himself as I see it, right? So for him to suddenly be, but I have an alter ego who's a scary demon, it's like, well, that's not your bit. Like,
No,
how does that
exactly.
even fit in with his worldview, you know, with the worldview where he wants to eat Hillary Clinton out or whatever?
I mean, it would be more of like Count Jacula or whatever the fuck his name is. You know who
I
I'm
mean,
talking
yeah.
about?
Can I tell you something? I think they are a little hard on Count Jacula at times. It's been a while since I listened to that episode. Because I actually remember listening to, we were talking about the podcast guys here referentially. I remember talking about the episode featuring Count Jacula, and I thought, like, you know, this guy's pretty cringe, but he's basically just doing like a horror host. He's just being kind of a weirdo about it. Maybe he's not reading the room well, but he's trying to do a horror host thing. So, just full disclosure, I've been a fan of the horror host community, which is one of the most incredibly autistic forms of content creation that there probably is. Very awkward guys and gals. And I legitimately, since I was probably in my late teens, well, I guess I was watching Ned the Dead when I was a kid, so I was like, oh, these guys are so cool. So maybe my evaluation of the horror host community is a little warped versus what most people would think. But what's funny is, like, and you mentioned horror hosts and haunts and things, there are remnants to the spook show still. One of the better resources to learn about them, to learn about spook shows, ghost shows, is this guy named Dr. Creep. And again, this is not a primary document. The only primary documents, for the most part, that we have about spook shows are ads in newspapers, we have flyers, and we have, like, radio ads. But there's this guy, Dr. Creep, who is himself, he hosts horror films, part of the horror hosting community, and his grandfather ran a spook show, right? He's this guy from down south, and his grandfather did a spook show, and his dad did haunts, and then was an early horror host, and now he's a horror host, and he's involved in, like, horror host, like, kind of community organizing and all these things. And he, like, wrote down, he asked his grandfather questions about their spook show and wrote them down. And that's one of the only, like, in-depth descriptions of a spook show that still exists. Because nobody in the moment thinks of this as, like, some important moment in horror history. It kind of is when you look at that. It's such a unique thing. And again, it captures this moment, not just in early horror, but kind of in early film, right? You know, kind of early pop culture as we know it. These are like carnies, right? These are like fly-by-night guys who are making art to make money really quick. They're travelers. They're kind of living on the fringe of society, and they're making these weird horror productions. They aren't preserving this for posterity. You do see echoes of it, right? So everyone listening to this has been to a haunt in October. Everyone's been to a haunt where everyone dresses up, and maybe there's a host or someone that guides you through the haunt, and everyone jumps out, and, you know, maybe as you're walking through, there's some really gory displays to get your blood pumping. And the nature of a haunt is that it's a performance, right? But it's interactive, or it feels interactive. That's the spook show, like the monster host thing. Those guys indirectly, because again, a lot of them are too young to have seen a spook show themselves, but the gestures that your horror host, that your Ned the Deads, are all things that would have been adapted maybe from a spook show. It's likely that some of the first horror hosts, like maybe Zachary or Goulardi, if they didn't host spook shows themselves, maybe weren't quite that old, probably were aware of them, probably saw them in early show business when they were coming up. And again, you see it in going back to the public domain horror bullshit. There's something you can do in horror that you can only really also do in pornography, right? Where you really push the ad campaign and the salaciousness, and the actual content, the actual product can be secondary to that, right?
No, absolutely. And, you know, talk about obviously the influence on later horror culture. But, you know, you're totally right about the idea that the advertising itself is sometimes better than the content. Now, obviously, Brian, of course, you and I are giant horror fans. We've mentioned on many times on the series. But let's be honest here. The thing that makes a lot of horror movies, especially in the past, what made a lot of horror movies salacious was, and interesting, was the advertising of it. From the box art of DVDs to movie posters to all those amazing like 80s and 70s trailers where they had that one creepy guy who I don't think was Don LaFontaine, but it might have been somebody else. But either way, those were the things that really were like, oh, I need to watch this movie like right fucking now. And sometimes it was worth it. A lot of times it wasn't. But at the same time, that definitely helped horror come into the modern age of its very much ubiquitousness as a entry level, not entry level and like obviously like shitty.
Accessible.
Very accessible, exactly. Very accessible film genre where you can make a really good horror movie for a couple million or even a couple $100,000, where you're not going to really make a good movie of almost any caliber in any other genre, let's be honest here.
Yeah, but you need that ad campaign, right? You need the craziest ad campaign. Now, from what we understand, it doesn't seem like a lot of the spook shows were ripoffs like that. It seems like a lot of them, you know, they have this interactivity, they have this multimedia media angle. They have these live performances. It seems like they were fairly high effort. But a lot of it, right, is about this is a traveling show and it comes into town and you start seeing the ads in your newspaper. And so a lot of the ads that I found are based on the idea of going there for a day, right? It's like, girls, you and your new boy are going to come to the spook show and you're going to see if he's really a man, right? That's a big ad campaign they go back on. The other thing is that they will say things like so they would often have, and this is illegal, but didn't matter back then. This is a different time. They would have actors dress up in like a knockoff Frank Pierce Universal Frankenstein or Universal Wolfman outfit. And then they'd have in the ad, they'd see like, come see Frankenstein in person.
You know, that's that kind of fucking like copyright violating shit that's just so awesome to see, like that bootleg ass shit. It's so awesome. Like when you see some guy dressed up as Spider-Man at like a kid's birthday party or something, like it's just so funny to me to see that. It's like, hey kids, it's fucking Spider-Man. And it's like a fucking
with a beer
like
gut,
spirit Halloween. Yeah, it's a beer gut and a spirit Halloween costume, and then he does like a fucking like backflip and hits his head and he like goes unconscious.
But to those kids, like they don't know the difference. That's Spider-Man. And what I would not say this in a derogatory way about people of the time, but to people in maybe their teens and 20s in the 1930s, 1940s is when the spook show really starts taking off. I'm sorry, you don't know the difference between Boris Karloff Frankenstein monster in the dark and someone in a kind of semi-convincing mask. Like, maybe you know the difference, but if you're scared, you're scared. And especially if, first of all, a lot of these shows, even though they're showing a horror movie, they also do a quote-unquote seance. And they do quote-unquote magic, which is a thing that still would have scared a lot of people in the 40s into the 60s, right? So they've already got that going on. They've already kind of got you all amped up with that. Then they showed you some creepy movie. And now King Kong is out here. It seems like people had a lot of fun here, but it seems like at the time they were considered like genuinely scary too. These were these big cultural events, especially it seems like for young people. This kind of predates rock and roll. So in a lot of ways, it's, horror movies are one of the first quote unquote youth culture things because they're really the beginning of the teenager, of the young adult is rock and roll. This sort of seems like a thing that's couched in, aimed at that demographic pre-rock and roll. So really one of the first things like that. The spook show, people have tried to bring it back. I just don't think you can. So some of the horror hosts that I like have done a spook show, like a retro spook show, and they say this too at every time. It's never going to be the same, right? Because first of all, the type of person like me that goes to see a horror host is not like some kid in the 40s that's going to be scared and excited to see Frankenstein. It's like a nerd, right? And it's a lot more self-aware when these horror hosts do a contemporary spook show, and it's like the whole audience is in on the joke, right? Which is cool and fun, but you're never going to recreate that moment. This moment that bridges like early Hollywood with like Carney Barker and kind of religious paranoia, right? Not paranoia, but like religious tradition or whatever.
Real quick though, Brian, actually, I was just going through the Wikipedia real quick. I read the Wikipedia of ghost shows before recording this, and I did look up a little bit of stuff on like print advertisement, but I just realized this connection. Is Monsters Crash the Pajama Party related to midnight ghost shows?
So, like I said, there aren't a lot of primary documents for the ghost shows because really the end of the ghost show is the mid-60s, which is kind of like when you would start, the end of the 60s is when we start taking film a little more seriously and we start preserving it a little better. There is a short film called Monsters Crash the Pajama Party, which came out in the 1960s, which is one of the last major spook shows that is still often remembered. It's very 60s. It's very campy. It's campier than some of the earlier spook shows seem to have been, because some of the 40s ones seem like they were pretty creepy. But yeah, Monsters Crash the Pajama Party is absolutely a remnant of a spook show. It's one of the only direct primary documents from a spook show. One of the things that's different about it is it's mostly in the film, right? So in Monsters Crash the Pajama Party opens with kind of a monologue by this creepy host who's hypnotizing you. That's in the film. But traditionally, a person would have come out on stage and said that little preamble to you before the movie started. Monsters Crash the Pajama Party does this thing where, in Scooby-Doo style, these teen characters in the movie, they split up. And then the movie pauses. And then there's like 4 actors in the audience that are dressed like the teen actors in the movie. And then a gorilla who's tormenting these kids in the movie comes out and seizes one of them. And the idea is that to the audience, it's like, wow, they walked out of the movie and they snatched this person and they pulled them back into the movie. Now, I think by the 60s, people probably were already maybe less scared of bits like this. But Monsters Crash the Pajama Party is very fun. One of the things I want to recommend for this, because again, it's one of the only primary documents, Something Weird Video released the Monsters Crash the Pajama Party DVD. So there's a lot of cool stuff on that DVD. Because it's so much later, it's not, as far as I can tell based on just stuff I've read. It's probably not a great representation of the overall history of the pajama party, because again, it came out basically at the end of the genre. There are reports that some spook shows went on to the late 70s, but I would imagine that the traveling performers that were making their living doing spook shows by 1976, 77 were probably in rough straits, to be honest.
Yeah, I would think so because, yeah, especially by that point, people were doing not necessarily more
Slashers.
hardcore stuff and slashers and stuff like that, but even just like the traveling, like carnival freak show stuff or just, traveling shows, they would have moved on to much different stuff, like literally freak show stuff. Like traveling freak shows would have been probably more societally seen as scary than fucking this stuff.
Well, I think a lot of the classic spook shows would have like sideshow, freaks, for lack of a better word, at them. They would sometimes incorporate them into like the scariness, and they before showing a movie they'd show you someone with like hydrocephaly or something, trying to find the words to say because I'm on record, I don't want to talk about a condition derisive, you know what I mean.
Disability, especially back in the 30s and 40s or whatever, that was during the heyday of eugenics, so that would have been terrifying to a certain type of American.
Well, no, it would have been, because again, the average person doesn't have, even now people don't understand people with other medical conditions, much less then. You see someone and you're like, oh, this is an aberration of God. That could happen to me. How do I know my kid's not going to be? Obviously, these are all awful things to think, and this is like a very bad negative impulse in people, but it wouldn't have been uncommon. And that's the root of the freak show, right? Of the carnival barker. Yeah, going back to, I would think that by the end of the 60s, the spook show is in rough straits, because by then, first of all, people have TV. People can't watch horror movies whenever they want because, we don't have VCRs yet. But it's not so hard as it would have been in the 40s and 50s to go out for a creepy night. The guys that, especially when I think by the 70s, the guys and women that would have been making spook shows back in the day, God, they don't have to do that much work. They can just make an original movie for a few $1,000s, a really cheap, like a Texas Chainsaw Massacre ripoff, and then show that at local drive-thrus. Probably make the same amount of money as they would with a spook show by then, or more.
No, exactly. So I think this is a very interesting topic to, obviously, like you said, talk about the influence on modern horror and stuff like that. And, we're not going to get into this movie because it's just a giant piece of shit. But I watched something that I thought might have been related to spook shows just a little bit before recording. Holy shit, was that not worth watching? I'm going to be honest with you. It was one of the After Dark Horror Fest movies, which I would say might be an attempt to bring back something like nostalgic horror in a way. But it was the movie Dark Ride, starring Jamie Lynn Sigler. Are you familiar with this one,
I've
Brian?
seen that.
Dog shit movie.
With the kid from The Sandlot.
Yep, who I was like, oh, that's the guy from the fucking Goonies that represented, what the fuck was that kid's name from the Goonies, the Asian one? I can't remember. The one who is
Data.
The one from Everything Everywhere All at Once, who won an Academy Award, who, by the way, is his agent is Chunk from the Goonies, which is hilarious.
Yeah, it is awesome. Yeah, Dark Ride, actually, I forgot about that movie, and it's not good, you're right. It does have visual allusions to the spook show. It also has allusions to just like the tradition of haunts. That's a bad movie. Although, yeah, it does have visual references to the classic spook show, and like kind of like not plot essential like spook show references, but there's like dialogue in there that's meant to refer back to like the old-timey spook show. One of the things with the spook show that we're probably always going to have to wonder about is, first of all, like how scary were it, right? Because when people talk about them, they talk about them as the most fun, scariest, most exciting thing. But it's like any sort of lost media like that. It's going to get blown up in your mind, right? The other thing that I think about is how different was it from going to a movie now? To me, as someone born in 1991, this seems so incredibly different from most experiences I've had in a movie theater. The interactivity, the performance angle, kind of the liveliness of it, it seems very different from what we think of as going out or even going to like a play or something now. I would imagine there were people that went to horror hosts, and every year there's less, or to not to horror host shows, but to spook shows, that every year there's less of them. I bet some of those people remember those shows their whole life though. And again, I just don't see any way you bring this particular multimedia kind of immersive format back, especially like the seance angle, because it seems like the seance was a very important part of the early ghost show, and people had different attitudes about those types of things. Now, people were taking it serious. Harry Houdini did seances, it was like a real thing people did, and that seems so core to the spook show kind of premise, right? We're showing you a scary movie, but we're also interacting with ghosts.
I mean, that's the thing though, Brian. You talk about how we could bring that back to like a modern age, but like, let's be honest here. Americans are increasingly becoming more deranged and believing in fantastical things. So I could imagine something like that would be able to come back, not really on like a mass scale, like, like 500 people show up to see it at a time, but a small TikTok or Instagram fucking creator were to do something like this, there would be a lot of people being like, ooh, I think this is actually real because, the Illuminati is trying to convince, whatever stupid bullshit they believe. And then on top of it too, Harry Houdini, of course, another famous Wisconsinite, Brian, maybe our favorite Wisconsinite.
Wisconsin excellence, of course.
Absolutely, Wisconsin fucking excellent. That's the thing is that back in the day, he was like, hey, don't you want to see me do a magic trick here? Don't you know? No, I'm kidding. He didn't sound like that. He's from Hungary. But like you're talking about seances, like he did do seances, but what I think is really interesting is that he was intensely intent on making sure that people knew that this was not real. This was part of a stage show because he had a crusade against people who were like spiritualists who tried to convince actual people that they were talking to their actual dead loved ones. Like he was, how that South Park episode where they shit on that one guy, John Edwards, not the vice president or presidential candidate, but the like mystic, not mystic.
Oh, yes. Cold reading guy.
Yep, the cold reading guy. But he was like that like a fucking 100 years ago, which is crazy to think about. He was like Penn Jillette, and also he was like that one guy who, what the fuck was that one? I know he died fairly recently, but he was the guy that was like, I'll give you $1 million if you can prove magic is real, but for like seances.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I think the thing is that people obviously are going to believe what they want to believe. And so people get so worked up in that I'm sure, I would bet you that Houdini had experiences where he did like a performative seance, and the people that he was there to entertain and to prove the falseness of it to probably got so worked up that they wouldn't even hear him say that it was fake. He inadvertently probably strengthened their belief in it by giving them a scenario to immerse themselves in. I had thought about this thing where, we are experiencing, unfortunately, we're experiencing kind of a new like Christian awakening in the US, I guess. How people believe all kinds of weird shit. People believe in giants on TikTok and all these things, right?
Don't forget about rapture talk.
Oh yeah, the rapture thing. There is a type of person that's all in on this. The thing is that if you did that now, right? If you did something like this spook show now, it couldn't be a fun horror thing. Like the thing with the spook show is that it was able to toe this line, and that, well, some people definitely probably believed or at least were intrigued by ideas of magic and seances. They were still there to have a good time. If I do a seance online and I get a bunch of weirdos to believe it's real, all semblance of fun goes out the window now, because they're going to make it some extreme statement that like this seance proves everything I believe. You're playing with fire, right? You try to harness that crowd for your multimedia entertainment project.
Yeah, exactly. And the last thing we want to do is make already scared, violent Americans even more scared and violent by convincing them that whatever voodoo you're doing is actually real.
Yeah, further entrench them in their dark fantasy that they have dug their heels into.
I mean, America's the world's richest third world country. That's the best way I can describe America.
And it's getting less rich and more third world every day.
We're going to be Brazil soon, straight up. The Brazilification of America is already underfoot.
Yeah. Not to put too fine a point on it, I think it's going to happen faster than any of us think. It might be as simple as in the next few months, we'll all wake up and we'll just be like, stuff's really bad, and I don't know when it's getting better. And you know what? Maybe then we will see a revival of the spook show, just like we saw it really take off in the late 1930s and into the 1940s. Maybe. Maybe that will be my one single dark prize, my silver lining. The rain from my black cloud that falls with the collapse of empire will be a return of the spook show. There are no primary documents for this. There's Monsters Crash the Pajama Party, and there's, accounts by Dr. Creep, like I said, whose grandfather had a spook show. There's ads and there's flyers. There isn't much.
No, it doesn't seem like there is. But, I did have one thing to say about, and it was James Randi. That was the guy who tried to, prove that magic was, not prove. He had people attempt to prove that it was real, and he offered them $1 million if they could prove magic was real, but nobody ever was able to do it, obviously, because he was a trained magician in the past and was able to easily debunk basically every, hack magicians being like, hey, look what I can do with my fingers or whatever the fuck. That's the thing. At, I think, the very first revival of the Ghost Show or the Midnight Spook Show, they should have have a seance where they bring James Randi back from the dead to be like, he said magic is real now.
That would be awesome, though. Like, if you did something that self-referential and you found a guy that kind of looks like him and he came back and it's like, wow, I was such a fool. And you kicked off your show with that. Like, so I guess magic in the afterlife is real after all.
Yeah, ooh, and that would be pretty funny. You know, Brian, if we ever become, once again, Mr. Beast big and we try to bring the Spook Show, Midnight Ghost Show back, we will have all the things related to our podcast as part of the Midnight Ghost Show.
Oh, that would make me so happy, Taylor. So, a dream of mine that I keep on the back burner has been to do a horror hosting show at some point and just, like, host public domain horror movies online with, like, a persona. I've even written, like, little, like, practice scripts with bits and picked out which movies I would do. That's a secret project that I harbor that I hope to do someday.
Hell yeah, absolutely. That'd be really fucking fun. And that's the thing, though, is that you could come up with different ones. Like, you could dress up as fucking Kurt Wimmer and talk about all these amazing hot couch guy movie ideas.
What I would do, actually, is I would have my persona, but then I would develop personas for my friends, like, so they could be recurring characters. That's the thing I thought about doing for it, which I think is what all the horror hosts these days do anyways. Because the funny thing about the horror hosting community, which, to be clear, is probably the most direct line to the Spook Show, even though it's on a much smaller scale, is the horror host community. Like, most horror hosts aren't on television now, right? They're online. So they're all just watching each other's content.
Yeah, it's a very incestuous community online, for lack of a better word. I know, obviously, Count Jacula wants it to be literally incestual, but I mean in the figurative incestual sense.
Is that the guy that said that, like, the top 10 hottest monsters, and one of them was, like, a giant blob?
Oh, no, like, straight up, when he's called Count Jacula, it's because he wants to fuck monsters. Like, that's his thing.
Yeah.
Oh, God. But, you know, speaking of people want to fuck monsters, Brian, I think that concludes at least my overall opinions on the Midnight Ghost Show / Spook Show. Do you have any final thoughts before we get to our pluggables?
The only thing I really want to say, if you're interested in this topic at all, like I said, there's not very many primary resources. There's a few things that I would advise. So, Something Awful Video put out a DVD called Monsters Crash the Pajama Party.
Something weird, not something awful, Brian, because...
I said something awful, didn't I? Yeah, you don't want to find the Something Awful video. Something Weird video. Be careful with those Something Weird videos, too. If you pick out the wrong one, you might end up in some weird areas anyways. Something Weird video put out the Monsters Crash the Pajama Party DVD, which includes the full film Monsters Crash the Pajama Party, which is a fun film. It's a film that was shown in a 60s spook show. But really, the juice there is in the special features on that DVD. One of the special features is just a collection of spook show radio ads and flyers. Just like print-out scans of flyers from flyers and newspaper ads, and then audio from radio ads promoting local spook shows from like the 1940s to the 1960s. That is actually, as weird as this sounds, because there's such scant information, that is one of the better primary documents of the spook show experience we have. Horror host Dr. Creep has spoken at length and written down interviews with his grandfather and stories from his family lore. His grandfather and father ran and operated spook shows, and he's done some documenting, some secondhand documenting of that. There is a book that I found out about in preparation for this episode that I very nearly bought. Last week I was thinking of getting it rush delivered as research for the show, called Ghost Masters, written by Mark Walker in 1991, last published in 1994. Ghost Masters is the only book, as far as I can tell, that is a full documentation of the spook show phenomena. It's mostly images, it's photos, it's scans, it's interviews with guys that did spook shows. They called them the Ghost Masters. That's what, like, the master of ceremony was at the spook show. Taylor, if I told you, oh, there's this book about the history of spook shows, I'm thinking you're getting it. It's out of print, but how much would you guess that book might run me? What would you think is a reasonable price for this book?
How big is the book is the question.
Not that big.
Then I would hopefully say $30 to $40 at most.
No, I can get it on Etsy, where, you know, it's probably a copy that was stolen, that's still in shrink wrap, for $80.
That's a little steep, if you ask me.
A little bit. Amazon, which the reason I go with Amazon typically before Etsy is because I know that I'll get it. It is $205 over Amazon. Like I said, this book appears to be a couple hundred pages. And that's not the fault of the author. Like, this seems to be the definitive book about the spook show phenomenon. It has very positive reviews from people, including John Carpenter got a copy of it and said he really liked it. I don't think John Carpenter ever saw a spook show. I don't think he's quite that old. Penn Jillette also, he wrote a review and he said he really liked it. It seems to be a cool book. book, my guess is that it was a niche subject, limited run when it was printed. But because there's so little documentation about the spook shows, everyone that wants to learn about that has bought that book when it came out. And now just all the copies are gone. But like I said, this is the only book that I'm aware of about the spook show and their history and their visuals, and it's $200 on most websites. It's very out of print. As far as the specifics of what the show is like, we'll probably never know that. But if you're a horror fan, I mean, if you're a fan of pop culture in general, but really if you're a fan of horror, and if you're interested in things the way we talk about them on the show, how we talk about the passage of time, looking at a piece of art from a different era kind of changes the meaning of it, changes how it's perceived. This is a really unique case study in that, because literally the spook show can only exist in the early 20th century. There is too much of a holdover from like late 19th century, and by the mid 20th century it was obsolete. By the 70s this was like a joke. So this is a very particular thing where in the evolution of horror and the evolution of film and like just the evolution of kind of American performance art, there's this moment of just really 20-30 years where this thing kind of thrives, and then it's just completely gone, completely obsolete. And that's what I think is really interesting about it. But yeah, if you want to buy a copy of Ghostmasters, or if you want to send me a copy of Ghostmasters, that's probably one of the better ways to learn about it. Otherwise, one of the better things I can tell you is to get the Monsters Crash the Pajama Party DVD from Something Weird Video and check the special features. It's not much, but unfortunately, it's about all we've got.
No, absolutely. And, my final thoughts, well, real quick before my final thoughts, talked about Something Awful video, Brian. We talked about Brazil earlier. I know Something Awful had a very legendary Brazilian-related video, if you know what I mean, Brian. Are you familiar with that one?
I am. I think we should do a Something Awful episode soon.
Oh, absolutely. There is an insane wealth of content. But no, real quick with the, Midnight Ghost Show, Spook Show thing. I love this kind of stuff, even though obviously I never saw it in person. I mean, even our parents probably wouldn't even remember all the details, even if they saw one, because it was just so long ago during its heyday. But like, obviously, as we said earlier, we love horror. We love all the things that inspired horror to a certain extent. I mean, not all of it. Like, of course, H.P. Lovecraft, we didn't like his racism. I mean, I will never say his cat's name, to be honest with you. Have you ever said his cat's name in public, Brian? But no, in general, like, this kind of stuff is very fascinating to me, especially in a subject that I was only mildly familiar with. Honestly, mostly because of Monsters Crash the Pajama Party, which is, something that I've been aware of for a while because, AVGN talked about it, and then you had it on DVD, and you gave it to me on DVD, and I've watched it quite a few times. It's very entertaining. It is extremely bad, but it is very entertaining at the same time. It is campy.
It's good to put on, like, let's say you were having a small Halloween party, like you and your like close friends, and you just wanted some fun Halloween party background noise. It'd be a good thing to put on.
No, absolutely. Very fun. You can watch it with the girlies. They might like it. Who the hell knows?
Yeah.
If you have a particularly nerdy girlfriend, they might like it. Although, we did talk about the autism thing earlier, Brian. You are right that I think that horror hosts and train enthusiasts might be the most autistic fan base of all time.
I mean, they have to be. I love the horror hosts. Like, I actually still, like, when I am just up at night chilling and I'm like, I'm going to have a night in and I'm going to watch a horror movie. Because all these are, for the most part, they're public domain movies. I follow all these, like, current horror hosts on YouTube who are probably people that, like, they have day jobs and stuff, but they host public domain horror movies and they do little skits and have their costumes. And I love it. I might even watch one tonight after the podcast because it's October 27th. I might run to the Plaid Pantry across the street and get some bad food and watch a horror host program. To me, it's so cool. And it's so, like, this thing with both horror hosts, and I think the Spook Show ties into this, is that in entertainment, there used to be local flair, right? And it wasn't underground. It wasn't for underground, like, film nerds or whatever. It was for the general public. It was for popular viewing. But there was kind of, like, more makeshift, grassroots, local flair stuff that people would go see. Television used to have local programs. Spook Shows kind of reflected in that. Part of the reason you won't see that is obviously just because people aren't going to get excited about something like that. They're not going to be scared by a seance or a magic trick anymore, or fooled by the tricks the same way, the William Castle-esque tricks. But the other reason you're not going to see it is because it's impossible to travel around with a film reel and show your movie and just keep all the profits at a public space. Because everything is owned by fucking studios now. Everything's so regal, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. But my final thought real quick is anything related to horror, we love it, folks. It's fucking awesome. I love cheesiness. I love camp. I saw Freddy's Dead, including a Q&A by the director, Rachel Talalay, before the showing of it just a few days ago. And that was a very campy, very funny horror movie. And I remember she talked about it specifically, about how it was really drilled in by the studio that, like, we want comedy. We want it to be funny. This has to be funnier. And all the cameos, interestingly enough, actually, the cameos were mostly her idea, which is awesome.
The cameos are great, though. Like, you've got Tom Arnold and Roseanne Barr, Alice Cooper. After you told me you were seeing it in theaters with a Q&A, I watched it. Like, I immediately put it on.
Interesting. I mean, you know, as we've said in private, that is maybe the worst Nightmare movie. I mean, the remake's the worst, easily. Even though I've never seen the remake, it looks terrible.
I watched the remake for the first time this month. It's so bad, Taylor. So, just real quick, since we're talking about it, the worst Nightmare on Elm Street film, not counting the 2010 remake, is probably Freddy's Dead. But I think I like Freddy's Dead more than New Nightmare. You know, and I like New Nightmare. I love Wes Craven. I think it's actually, in terms of quality, it's one of just the best made Nightmare on Elm Street films. But because it doesn't take place in the Elm Street universe and it's not part of the Freddy lore, I kind of feel a little separate from it.
I can understand that, but my whole thing is, and obviously your reason for not liking it as much as the others is totally valid, but I'm curious, do you think it has anything to do with the fact that it obviously didn't start this era, because there are plenty of movies that came out before it, but do you think it's because it's like the Seinfeld effect with like meta horror? Do you think that's what it is? Because nowadays meta horror is so hack, but like back then that was a pretty revolutionary concept.
No, because I like that. I don't dislike Wes Craven's New Nightmare, to be clear. I like it. And I like the meta elements, and I think that he did the meta stuff even better in Scream. I know people like to talk shit about Scream, but I think the first one's a great murder mystery, and it's a great commentary on like the evolution of slasher films. It's more like, so for me with the Elm Street movies, getting into the most nerdiest, earnest place, I really identify with the core Elm Street premise that these are like kind of lonely, alienated kids who like are kind of coming of age, and they're feeling all this frustration and all this loneliness. That's what Freddy's preying on. Freddy is like this predatory adult who like these like kind of wounded teenagers need to assert themselves against, you know. He's kind of like this dark side of authority. What Wes Craven is using Freddy for in New Nightmare is a very interesting, very cool thing, but it's kind of different from that, right? Because in New Nightmare, my feeling is that he's kind of self-referentially commenting on the way that Freddy was bastardized by New Line. Because his vision of Freddy is this pedophilic child murderer, and New Line basically takes this character and markets it to kids. And I feel like that's kind of what Wes Craven is saying in New Nightmare, right? It's almost like an indictment of New Line and their attitude towards the violence of the Nightmare on Elm Street films. I like New Nightmare a lot. I love all the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. But because what I respond to is like that classic, that Elm Street lore, you know, Bastard, Son of 1,000 Maniacs. I feel like New Nightmare to me is a little separate from the other films.
No, that's totally fair. I mean, at least for me, I haven't watched all the movies in a row in quite a while, so maybe if I rewatch them, I might feel the same way that you do. I mean,
we should do that.
You know, maybe we should as part of our horror host. Well, actually, we can't because those aren't public domain. But you know what I'm saying?
We could watch some public domain Nightmare on Elm Street knockoffs, which do exist, and then in the segments, the host segments, we could talk about Nightmare on Elm Street, the series.
Well, we could do that too, but Brian, honestly, if we ever did like a horror host series, we would watch Tubi movies first. Like really bad Tubi movies first.
There's so many public domain horror movies. So actually, I have a working list, mostly of ones from the 50s and 60s that I think would be good to do. You know, Driller Killers in the public domain.
Yes, and that's something, of course, we very famously reviewed and talked about how actually not really violent it is, so it shouldn't have been a video nasty. But I feel like that's probably a fairly, you know, anodyne opinion at this point.
I think what people are surprised by when they watch it is like, oh, it's kind of artsy, you know? And actually, I think there's an element of even bring back the spook show thing to Abel Ferrara. Not in a direct one-to-one sense. Abel Ferrara, though, is very aware that he can use, like, exploitation film, trapping, like, media outrage, and, like, local fervor. Get people to see these weird kind of films that are actually, while they're violent, are usually kind of introspective and kind of, like, artsy. That goes back, there's kind of a little bit of Carnival Barker to that, too, right? So even at the heart of, like, exploitation film, which I don't run away from the phrase exploitation. I don't think it's a pejorative. I love exploitation. But key to that is what the Ghostmasters and the spook shows are doing, right? They're working up, they're wriggling into that collective, like, anxiety, and they're kind of stirring the pot and getting everyone to go see this crazy, outrageous thing.
No, absolutely. But you know what, Brian? Speaking of things that are spooky and ghost showy, and speaking of midnight, because we got to go to bed soon, but I think that ends our episode of the Midnight Ghost Show / Spook Show. So let's get into our pluggables, shall we? So you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on Twitter.com. And as well, please subscribe and follow us on both of our YouTube and our Spotify channels, where we are uploading every episode simultaneously to both platforms. And as well as always, please donate to Lucifer and the Father campaign. You know, of course, our good friends Scott, Sean, and Robert are creating and literally filming right now a fantastic series. You know, they need more of our moral and financial support to continue to get their series off the ground and make even more episodes after these next few ones that they're making. So please feel free to donate because, of course, once again, they've been great to us. They've been great to the show. They've really helped us along in a lot of ways, and they've been very communicative in their goals on filming future episodes. And, you know, our promise to you is always, if you donate to the campaign, just send us YouTube comments, send us an email, and we will, within reason, match your donations about $20-25 because we want Scott, Sean, and Robert's dreams to become a reality. Now, Brian, do you have any updates that you'd like to share now?
I do. I don't want to speak for Scott too much. Scott has been continuously in touch with me just with updates about production. I don't want to speak for him, but they are in it. Like, production is like rolling around along and happening. I do want to stress, as Taylor said, still though, if you're inclined to do so, if you can afford to do so and you'd like to help out just some ambitious independent filmmakers, please consider sending something. It's a big concept. It's a high concept. It took them a while to work up the necessary funds, but what I would like to stress is it is happening now. So it's beyond this, like, we need to raise up the money to happen for it to start happening. They're going to make it. So it's an even better time, if you are so inclined to donate to help them out, to do it now, because they are actively in production and they can use every little bit that we can help them generate to put that towards making the picture even bigger, even better, and even more satisfying for them and for us, of course. We need to scrounge up this money. The movie's being made. If you want to help them out with that, please consider donating.
Yes, absolutely. And as well, talking about donating to the campaign, you know, of course, our good boy Luigi is still facing down the barrel of 2 state governments and the federal government for bullshit, trumped up charges for things that he didn't do. And I feel like, I know the New York trial is happening fairly soon, but at the same time, he needs all of our moral and financial support to hopefully have the best possible trial. And once again, as we always say, if this trial were to be held today, he would be found not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. There's just no good evidence against him that would implicate him beyond a reasonable doubt in the killing of Brian Thompson. There just isn't. We believe in our boy Luigi.
Yep. We know it. You know it. And most importantly, the prosecution and the arresting officers know it.
Absolutely. And, you know, I will say one error that I've been making recently, because I forgot to update the URL, and I apologize. I'll make sure it is updated in the subsequent episodes. But the old link for the Luigi Mangione Defense Fund is a dead link. So I can't remember what it is now. I believe it's a specific website now, not Give, Send, Go, which, to be fair, is good. That means there's more legitimacy to it now that it's its own website instead of just Give, Send, Go. Because Give, Send, Go is just a Christian crowdfunding website. There's no accountability to, like, actual people who believe in the cause. It was just up there for a while. And, you know, one of those things where I'm glad they were able to have it up because, you know, Christians in America are generally pretty fucking reactionary, especially Christian capitalists are incredibly reactionary in America. So I'm glad they were able, or they were willing to have their fucking crowdfund up. But at the same time, now it's on a more official website. So I have updated the URL in all subsequent episodes. And, you know, as I always say, because both Brian and I have donated to the cause at this point, if you donate to the cause, you know, just like with the Lucifer and the Father campaign, just send us a YouTube comment, send us an email, just send us proof that you donated. We will, within good reason, match those donations because, as always, we want Luigi to have the best possible trial. And, you know, speaking of people who are really just having trials and tribulations in life, you know, we have a Patreon as well. We have a crowdfund as well, essentially. So become our first patron today. We release about 2 to 4 episodes a month. Our current one that we've been plugging for a long, long time is the $5 tier, where you get every episode up to 48 hours early, because we always say the first 48 hours are the most important. You know, when you're trying to talk to your weird normie coworkers who are always blasting Stained and Drax and fucking Tom McDonald, you know, you want something that they can relate to, which is 40s, 50s, and 60s traveling.
Donate to the Patreon, became a patron. We will do a Drax episode.
No, absolutely. And we do have another tier, which is the $100 episode, where we're saving it for one Patreon, where you get 2 episodes a month at least. And I will tell you that if you do that, we will 100% talk about Drax with you for like 2 hours. That is absolutely worth the money.
I mean, 100%. You do that, I will talk about whatever you want.
We're very cheap escorts, to be very clear.
Yeah.
Oh, God. But yes, so please donate and become a patron of ours today, I should say. And then, Brian, do you have any pluggables as well?
As always, follow us, Taylor and I, and the show at Millennials Are Old Pod on Instagram and Threads. There's also the Facebook page, Millennials Are Old. You can follow me personally at JLo Biafra on Instagram and Threads. JLOBIAFRA. Instagram and Threads remains the best, most consistent, most reliable way to get a hold of me related to the show. If you want to criticize us, if you lived through a spook show and we got it all wrong and you are 95 years old, your precious remaining days, you want to correct me on the history of the spook show and how I, as a millennial, killed the spook show industry, don't know what I'm talking about, reach out on Instagram and Threads, either at Millennials Are Old Pod or at JLoBF.
Absolutely. So feel free to follow our socials today. And Brian, speaking of social things and midnight spook shows, my social battery is drained and it's almost midnight. So I think we should go to sleep. At least it's almost midnight on my time zone. How about you, Brian? Are you fucking tired? Are you old as shit? And is your social battery dead?
My social battery is dead, but in truly classic Brian asocial tradition. So in the last 5 years, I've become more social. I've also started eating marginally better and watching less TV, but I'm going to revert back to my late teens and early 20s. I think I'm going to go buy some garbage food, and I'm either going to watch a horror host, or I might just watch old installments of James Rolfe and Cinemassacre's Monster Madness. Eat chips and candy until I fall asleep. I am going to be 34 next month, and I am acting like it.
No, absolutely. And Brian, real quick, if you want to be part of Monster Madness and not Movie Madness, that's fucking Portland, but Monster Madness, that's the thing, Brian. Just, put an AI prompt for a script in, and James will be like, holy shit, this is amazing. I need to include this in my episode.
I feel a little bad for him that happened.
Oh, no, that was total BS. That was not his fault at all.
I mean, I guess it was his fault to the degree that he didn't have the oversight, but it's like his problem was trusting his writer, right?
He is the sole breadwinner for a family of 3, including, I believe, 2 disabled or at least 1 disabled child. Like, come on, cut the guy some fucking slack.
But guess what? Those classic AVGN, classic Monster Madness, classic Cinemassacre stuff that he did out of love, that he did all by himself or he did with Mike Matai, those will always be there. You can always go back and watch them. But he's clocking in now.
Exactly. And nothing wrong with that. It's the same thing as when a guy puts in 25 years at the factory to take care of his fucking family. Like, just leave the guy fucking alone. If he fucks up every now and again, who cares?
If we were making James Rolfe money, I would do reviews like just Marvel movies. Like, hey, we're talking about Marvel. What's just a boring ass thing that I would never want to talk about? We would do that. Of course we would.
Absolutely.
Everyone
fucking
would.
Straight up. And talking about, once again, people who we respect but phone it in, we are going to phone in the ending of this episode, which we always do. So have a good night, everybody. Sleep tight. And you know what? We're going to come back with an amazing episode for you next time. And it's going to be a motherfucking doozy. Trust me.